last week you took a personality exam, and then this week what we are going to do in this video is kind of assess that personality exam, because there's lots of interesting information you can pull from a personality exam. Number one is that your personality is fairly genetic, and so you're kind of stuck with your personality. Now, we can make some slight improvements, and we're going to talk about that, but you can use this information to help determine what jobs might be compatible with you, what partners might be compatible with you, and so on. So we're going to take a look at that right now. Here you have extroversion. So you scored yourself, and it's like a 1 out of a 5 score. So if you're above a 3, that means you're more, or above like a 2.5, that means you're more extroverted. If you're below a 2.5, that means you're more introverted. And sometimes people think of shyness as being extroversion versus introversion, and it's not necessarily shyness. That's related to neuroticism, which is next. So for extroversion, if you're more introverted, this means you're more quiet, right? And being around people is exhausting for you. Whereas if you're high in extroversion, this is kind of the dopaminergic system, where being around people makes you feel good, gives you energy, right? And under each of the big 5 personality traits, like extroversion, there are 2 aspects, and you see assertiveness and enthusiasm, right? So assertiveness means you're willing to speak your mind and be upfront about things and maybe be a little confrontational. People that are high in assertiveness tend to get job raises more often. So that's an interesting thing. If you're low in assertiveness, you can actually train yourself. So are psychologists out there that teach assertiveness training. And then I'm fairly high in assertiveness. And then for enthusiasm, this is your like excitement or willingness to go out and have fun with friends. You like being around people a lot. I seem to be a little bit lower in enthusiasm, although I'm around the middle, so I'm not super low in enthusiasm. So how can we use this information? So for jobs, right? Let's say you're high in extroversion, particularly enthusiasm. You're going to be really good at sales potentially, right? Because you know how to talk to people. You like engaging with people. You might be really good at networking as well, like social networking, event planning, and so on. So these are like people who are very bright. They want to talk to people, right? They can sell things. So that is not really my personality, but I have some friends who are very good at that. So in terms of partners, right, let's say you have a partner who's low in extroversion and somebody who's high in extroversion. Well, there's going to be maybe some conflict there because somebody wants to go out whereas somebody wants to stay in, right? And so you need to learn how to manage that within your own relationship. So I highly recommend doing one of these for like a date night with your partner, because you can learn a lot about each other, right? So then you can say, okay, somebody's high in extroversion, they like to go out more often. So whereas my partner is introverted, so if they want to stay in, it might not be like a bad thing, right? Maybe you can go out and have a good time with your friends and then come home a little earlier to be with your partner who didn't want to go out, right? But in terms of like improving yourself, right? Let's say you're low in extroversion, because it's kind of nice. You need social interaction, right? And so if you're lower in extroversion, which is kind of how I am, especially in enthusiasm, you don't always want to go out. And so if you find that this is how you are, then you can decide, okay, I need to force myself to go out and hang out with people, because it's going to make you better and it's going to increase your extroversion a little bit, right? You may never be like super great at it or super love it, right? But you still need to interact with people. And so you can say, okay, even if I don't want to go out, I am going to force myself to go out, because that will make me a more well-rounded person. Okay, that's good on extroversion. Let's go on to the next one here. Oh, there we go. So neuroticism. So neuroticism is like negative emotion, whereas extroversion was more positive emotion. Extroversion people tend to be more confident, whereas neuroticism tend to be more self-critical. People talk about self-esteem a lot, and they say, raise your self-esteem. Well, one of the problems with that is that your self-esteem is fairly genetic, right? If you're higher in neuroticism, that means you're going to tend to be more critical of yourself. And I'm about mid-range in neuroticism, so I'm fairly critical of myself. And so what's good to know about that and how you can use that information is, if you are higher in neuroticism and maybe you are very critical of yourself and you have low self-esteem, well, then it's like, okay, right? You don't need to beat yourself up about that. It's like, okay, I may experience a little bit more negative emotion. One of the ways you can get over that is increasing your competence amongst different areas of life. So you can say, okay, so I experience a lot of negative emotions. So that means that I need to, one, maybe challenge myself a little bit and put myself in situations that make me uncomfortable. Because as you get more used to those situations, your anxiety is going to decrease. So people who are high in neuroticism also have a high risk of anxiety. And so that's another good thing to know, right? And if it's very high, anti-anxiety medications work very well with this because it's actually potentially tied in with the serotonin system, right? And again, these are like brain chemicals. So neuroticism breaks down into withdrawal, which is more like pulling away, especially when you're anxious, right? You don't want to be around people. Again, if you're going through depression or anxiety, sometimes you need to force yourself to go out, right? Kind of increase your extroversion a little bit, practice it at least. And then for volatility, this is like your mood swings a little bit, right? So if you realize that something's bothering you and it just kind of sets you off, right? And you're higher in volatility, again, the scores are 1 through 5. So if you're above a 2.5, you're going to be higher in volatility. And that's okay, right? There are some benefits that makes you more perceptive to certain things, right? But it can also make you a little bit less emotionally stable. And so if you are higher in volatility, which is where I'm at a little bit, I'm about mid-range in volatility and withdrawal, then you know, okay, when things are bothering me, I need to just kind of step back a little bit because my emotions tend to, go take control a little bit. And so that's how we can use that. In terms of jobs, if you're higher in neuroticism, you're going to want to look for like a lower stress job because you're already experiencing a lot of, well, sometimes you're going to be experiencing negative emotion. And so if we can limit that in your workplace, that would be pretty ideal. And then in terms of your partners, same thing, right? If one of your partners is higher in neuroticism, you need to realize like, okay, so that maybe they're more volatile, right? So there's a little bit more emotional drive there, right? And so you can say, oh, yeah, maybe they get a little bit more emotionally worked up. And if your other partner is low in volatility, then when they don't get emotionally worked up, you can say, oh, well, that's how they are. That's not like them just being mean to me, right? They just have lower volatility. And then so maybe you can calm down, both of you, and then you can talk about it later on. So there you go. That is neuroticism, right? Yeah. All right, let's go on to the next one. So for agreeableness, this one's pretty interesting. Agreeable versus disagreeable. So if you're low in agreeableness, this makes you more disagreeable. And these people are kind of like hard-headed, potentially tough, more straightforward, right? Straight to the point. Whereas agreeable people, they're very caring and compassionate. This is working with the oxytocin hormonal system. So like the cuddle hormone is what people call it, right? So you like being around people. So for jobs right here, if you enjoy being around people, you're high in agreeableness, you like helping people, well then different jobs like nursing or taking care of older people or helping people with disabilities, right? Interaction, this with extroversion is going to make you a very interactive person, right? So there are some, it breaks down, right? So then we have compassion and we have politeness. And one of the really interesting things about personality tests is your personality is fairly genetic again, and your personality also is predictive of who you vote for. So right now, people are mad at each side, right? Because each side thinks the other is stupid. But we need to make sure we don't hate the people who vote differently than us, because the way it works is people who are higher in compassion, more caring, right? They tend to vote more liberal, right? And then whereas people who are higher in politeness, which is like respect for authority, right? These people tend to be more conservative. So a lot of times when people are mad, like, oh, how could you vote for this person? It's like, well, it's probably a personality trait that's making them vote that way because they have priorities that you don't have necessarily. And that doesn't make somebody a bad person, right? So we want to make sure we're friends with everybody because that's going to make you more well-rounded. And if you isolate yourself, you're going to be less well-rounded. So like I said, for jobs, right? If you're high in agreeableness, being around people is going to be better. If you are low in agreeableness, which is kind of me, I'm mid on compassion and then I'm pretty low on politeness. And so for my agreeableness, I would be disagreeable. And this means that working with things and ideas may be a better job for me, although I am a teacher and I like it. So again, you can make these work for you in all kinds of ways. So in terms of your partner, right, if one is super agreeable and one is disagreeable, the agreeable person might feel like they're being walked all over because the disagreeable person is always putting their ideas forth, right? And the agreeable person just kind of wants to go along with that. So if you do this with your partner again, you can figure that out. Okay, I'm more agreeable. That means you need to practice standing up for yourself more. Whereas a disagreeable person, they might need to push less on their ideas, right? And like kind of accept that you're willing to go along with things a little more rather than, because if it gets really bad, it can turn into like a bully type situation where the disagreeable person is telling the agreeable person what to do all the time. So that agreeable person, you need to learn to stand up for yourself. That's kind of one of the ways you can improve yourself, because that can be a weakness, not being able to stand up for yourself. People who are also high in agreeableness can become resentful sometimes because they're not willing to say what they're thinking because they don't want to upset other people. And if you don't say what you think, that can kind of fester and cause some resentment. So, practice speaking your mind if you're agreeable. That would be a good thing. And then if you're disagreeable, practice accepting people for who they are rather than always having to put your idea out there. So I think that's pretty good on agreeable. Yeah, let's go on to conscientiousness. So conscientiousness, really interesting. This is actually one of the highest predictors of lifetime success. So if you're lower in conscientiousness, don't worry, because we've been doing this in this class actually. There are micro routines that you can practice to increase your conscientiousness. And that's why I built them into this class actually. So conscientiousness, this is like hard working. If you're lower in conscientiousness, you tend to be laid back, right? You might be more fun to hang out with rather than somebody who's always trying to work all the time. If you're high, you're probably trying to stay as busy as you can. And it breaks down into orderliness and industriousness. So for orderliness, this is your cleanliness and organization. And the way you can use this in your relationships is, you take the test with your partner, and let's say one of you is way more orderly than the other person. Well, then what that means is that the threshold for a mess that bothers that person who's high in orderliness is much lower than the person who is low in orderliness. So let's say your partner is low in orderliness, right? And it really bothers you because they just leave things everywhere. Well, then you can tell them, after you take this test, hey, look, you're lower in orderliness. The way you live your life, leaving things everywhere really bothers me. So if you could you pick up things before they bother you? Because what happens is the person in a relationship who is higher in orderliness, they are going to end up cleaning everything because things bother them first. And so, you can accept your partner for not being as cleanly, right? And then hopefully help them become more cleanly. And then on the flip side, you can accept your partner for being more cleanly, and you can say, okay, I'm going to try and, pick up some slack on my end because I know this bothers you. If we look at industriousness, this is like your ability to work hard and diligently and set schedules, right? And so this, I guess, for orderliness, to train this, right? You can pick up your room, right? That's why we're doing that sit for 10-minute assignment. And then for industriousness, you can create schedules and routines and habits, right? And that's why we're forming those in this class as well, because these things will set you up for lifetime success potentially. In terms of jobs, if you're high in conscientiousness, managers are really good. Lawyers, business types, right? These are people who want to have a lot on their plate and want to take care of it all. And not everybody wants to do that, and that's okay. But having some of those traits will be beneficial in your life, right? And if you're more laid back, that's fine. But just be aware, right? Learning how to set a schedule might be important. Learning how to clean up after yourself might be somewhat important in the long run. So, yeah. Oh, and then let's talk about politics again. So people who are high in orderliness tend to be more conservative, and people who are high in or who are low in orderliness tend to be more liberal, right? And that's not across the board because people are very complex, but it is a predictive factor in who you vote for. So again, let's not hate the other side. Okay, let's go on to the last one here. We have openness, and this breaks down into openness proper and intellect. And a lot of times we want to be high in intellect because we think, oh, that means you're intelligent. Not necessarily. There might be some ties to intelligence here, but not necessarily. So let's go to openness proper first. This is like raw creativity kind of. So like artists, people who are really interested in the aesthetic, right? What other kind of jobs? Entrepreneurial, right? These jobs. So these are very creative people. These are business starters typically. And people who are high in openness tend to be more on the left, right? Or on the liberal side of the spectrum. So, and you need both sides, right? Because you need to have somebody who's conscientious, who's like managerial and can run things efficiently and, make sure everything's getting done. And then you need somebody out there to provide new ideas and to explore new things and to, be open to things. So again, with the, the whole politics thing, it's like both sides need each other and both sides bring something important to the conversation. And that's why it's good to switch power, who's in power from time to time, because we can try out different directions. Because if you go in one direction, too far in either direction, you tend to end up in a disaster. So, okay, enough about that. So back to the openness proper. If you're creative, entrepreneurial, right? So these are business starters, artists, one of the problems with this one is it's very hard to like keep a steady job, right? And so like if you are trying to be an artist or something, the poor artist is kind of a motif out there. What you should think about doing is try to find like a part-time stable job that can support your artistic endeavor, because it's very hard to make it big and very few make it. So if you are super high in openness, very few people are successful in the market doing this, because only the most creative and the people who, and you can be the most creative but still not be discovered, right? And so having a backup plan is always going to be a good idea for openness proper. In terms of partners here, if your partner's always jumping around, let's talk about intellect first. So intellect is more like interest in ideas, right? And I seem to be fairly high in intellect, lower in openness proper. And so I'm very interested in ideas, philosophical thought, all these things. Some people have no interest, and that's okay. And so if you have a partner that's like that, right, it might help to have a partner who is also open to discussing ideas, because otherwise you might not be able to discuss those ideas. Or you should at least have friends, right? So if you are in a relationship where one is lower in openness, one is higher, well then make sure you have an outlet to get your ideas out there and be creative, right? And then if your partner is high in openness and you're low and they're being creative and stuff, make sure you're appreciating their creativity, because they're probably doing some really cool stuff, right? So okay, so that's how you can use that. So for this assignment, you're going to think about what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what jobs might work well for you, how you can negotiate this with your partner, and then think about some strengths and weaknesses that you have and how you can potentially work on those. So for openness, I didn't really talk about how you can work on that. Maybe reading more, but again, that's kind of a tough one. It's like if you're not very creative or not interested in those things, it might be worth your while to study that a little bit, but again, these are fairly genetic. So if you're low in openness, you're never going to probably train yourself to be super high in it. And same with extroversion, but you can shore up your weaknesses, and that's kind of what you want to be doing. All right, I've talked long enough. I will see you in the next video.